Welcome to the final lesson of the module. Here we will discuss practical application, including total daily carbs and the timing of nutrients relative to the training bout. So let's first discuss total daily carbohydrate. So carbohydrate needs vary widely according to total energy requirements, personal preference, and tolerance. Individuals without athletic performance goals do not have a hard minimum dosing requirement. So that whole cliche about carbohydrates being the non-essential macronutrient has a bit of truth to it in the sense that they're not required for survival of the organism. And in a similar sense, carbohydrate is not necessarily required for people with zero performance goals. One can argue that in the long term, proactively avoiding carbohydrate is going to have the opportunity cost of avoiding foods that are preventive of chronic diseases, and therefore you would be actually losing out in the long term by avoiding carbs. And in that sense, they could be essential for optimizing health. But it is true that people without athletic performance goals don't have an obvious or a concrete hard minimum dosing requirement for carbohydrate. On the other hand, and by the same token, individuals whose primary goal is body fat reduction need to accept the compromise between maximal athletic performance and energy restriction. So, if we were to boil this down into practical terms, sacrificing optimal carbohydrate intakes for athletic performance is what some people who are interested in body fat reduction and trying to force the kind of athletic performance goals together in combination. This is something that you'll see with clients who jump on, let's say, a 5K or a 10K or a half marathon as sort of an excuse to get in shape and to lose body fat and get more fit. And so with these types of cases, then the priority isn't necessarily optimizing or maximizing performance. It's sort of that goal has kind of getting smuggled into the side door of a main goal of losing body fat. So in that case, the client can consume about 1 to 3 grams per kilogram and still do decent in recreational level competition while losing body fat and sort of remaining in a caloric deficit during the preparation for this event. But it's nevertheless going to, or at least have a tendency toward compromising athletic performance when you are on a carb restricted regime that's around 1 to 3 grams per kilogram of body weight. But some people are willing to risk that for the goal of fat loss primarily. Okay. Individuals seeking to optimally support strength and power demands and or hypertrophy goals are best served with a total daily carbohydrate intake of 3 to 6 grams per kilogram of body weight and potentially up to 8 grams per kilogram. And most non-competitive recreational athletes in mixed sports generally do well with the 3 to 6 grams per kilogram total daily intake of carbohydrate. On the other hand, athletes seeking to optimize competitive performance in sports with endurance demands do best on 6 to 12 grams per kilogram of total body weight. And this is because the volume that they're running through the week is going to be significantly higher than the recreational athlete or the weekend warrior. So we kind of see these two tiers of carbohydrate intake according to the seriousness of the athletic goal. And usually with competitive endurance athletes, kind of this standard golden range of total daily carbohydrate intake is 6 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight. And then sort of the lower tier of like recreational athletes, and the range that happens to work well with hypertrophy goals is 3 to 6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And just a side note, fiber requirements per the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position stand on fiber is 14 grams for every 1,000 calories in the diet. So with a typical 2,000 calorie diet, you're looking at 28 grams of fiber. And fiber is sort of a simplified way to make sure that you're at least achieving a minimum quality level in the diet with carbohydrate choices. So next up, let's look at a classic, or increasingly becoming a classic study, 2013 study by Smith and colleagues, where they sought to find out what is the sweet spot for carbohydrate intake during exercise and endurance performance. So they gathered up cyclists and triathletes and they put them on a 2-hour exercise test at 70.8% of VO2 max, followed it with a time trial. And then what they did was they administered 12 carbohydrate electrolyte mixture doses, 12 doses of a carbohydrate electrolyte solution. And the 12 doses incrementally went from 10 to 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And they kind of optimized the mix of carbohydrate types to take advantage of the multiple intestinal transport, the multiple transportable carbohydrates that would each be transported through its own intestinal transporter to expedite gastric emptying. And so the way to do that is to do a 2-to-1 glucose to fructose. And in some cases, a 1-to-1 does similarly well. But in this case, they did a 1-to-1-to-1 glucose to fructose to maltodextrin mix. And they had these 12 graduated doses from 10 to 120 grams per hour. Okay. So hopefully that wasn't too confusingly put. The results, incremental performance improvements occurred until a peak performance level of 78 grams of carbohydrate per hour, after which point diminishing performance occurred from 78 on up to 120 grams. So 78 was where the sweet spot was. And that's why there is a curvilinear dose response relationship of carbohydrate and performance, with roughly 78 grams per hour being the maximally effective during exercise dose of carbohydrate. So this was an interesting finding. And my take on this is that we're just seeing that we're seeing what the ballpark is, because this value, 78 grams per hour, is an average of the group. And without a doubt, some people must have fallen above and below that mean, but it makes for a pretty good benchmark. And on a related note to the previous study, we have this gem by Colombani and colleagues who did a systematic review, and they strictly looked at non-fasted conditions. So they looked at real-world race conditions where subjects in a fed state, in other words, they had a meal within 2 to 4 hours prior to the test, prior to the exercise test. And they found that carbohydrate ingested near or during exercise have an unlikely effect with bouts up to 70 minutes or so, and a possible but not compelling ergogenic effect with performance durations longer than about 70 minutes. So they saw this this threshold of 70 minutes or more being benefited by carbohydrate consumed near or during exercise if the subjects were in a fasted state. And once again, the significance of that is that competitive endurance athletes and competitive athletes in general do not compete in an overnight fasted state. They always compete in a fed state in order to top off fuel stores and maximize their competitive capacity. So Colombani and colleagues did this systematic review based on studies that mimic real world conditions and found that unless your competitive bout is about 70 minutes and up, then if you're in a fed state, if the competitive bout is significantly less than 70 minutes and you've had a meal within 2 to 4 hours out from the event, then carbohydrate near or during exercise is not going to likely improve your performance. So that's what they found with this. Follow up by Hoch, Muller, and colleagues. They wanted to expand on Colombani's findings via an updated literature search to yield an extended number of studies to conduct a meta-analysis. So once again, they preserved the conditions where they tested fed subjects who were fed between 2 and 4 hours, 2 and 4 hours out from the exercise test. And they did not include time to exhaustion training, only time trial type of tests. And this is another strength of this analysis because time to exhaustion basically measures how many, what is the maximal duration you can sustain a given intensity of work. And a time trial measures how quickly you can complete a fixed amount of work. And the latter is much more reflective of real world race conditions than the former. So they found was across 16 studies that were included in the meta-analysis, a 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution just before and or while exercising longer than 90 minutes benefited male trained cyclists. Okay, there were insufficient data to draw conclusions for women. Okay, so the important point here is they found similar results to Colombani et al.'s systematic review, but the time threshold at which carbohydrate before and or during exercise benefited endurance was 90 minutes instead of a 70-minute duration. So put another way, they found that if you're in a fed state, if you consumed a pre-event meal 2 to 4 hours before the event, then the event needs to be at least 90 minutes in order for extra carbohydrate beyond that, like during the event or right before the event, to benefit exercise performance. So we're kind of like, if with these studies taken together, we're looking at, like, depending on how careful you want to be, a 70-minute threshold or a 90-minute threshold that would benefit from immediate carbohydrate fueling prior and or during the event. Okay, so let's kind of boil things down. Acute time-sensitive fueling requirements pre-exercise. So we have in the days leading to an event, the contemporary carbohydrate loading recommendations for endurance competition involve about 7 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight, about 1 to 3 days prior to competition. while training volume is tapered. So this is a more contemporary model of carbohydrate loading, whereas in the past you'd look at a week and that it would involve a carb depletion phase followed by a carbohydrate loading phase. And in more recent models, they've just seen similar effects with keeping carbohydrate high in a little bit more of a linear type of fashion, or at least a gradually escalating fashion from 6 to 7 up to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight per day in the 1 to 3 days leading to the competition. Event day fueling. So carbohydrate within the 4-hour window preceding events is, and we're talking about events that, once again, those thresholds that exceed 70 to 90 minutes. This is where you can consume 1 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight in carbohydrate, which is about 0.45 to 1.8 grams per pound. We're looking at the carbohydrate dose that you would consume within the 4-hour window. Now, granted, this is a wide range of carbohydrate dosing to put out there, half a pound to almost, I'm sorry, half a gram to almost a full gram per pound of body weight. The importance of individual trial and error cannot be underemphasized here, because there is no magic, universal, tight little recommendation that we can apply to everybody. That's why there's ranges here. Protein feeding recommendations. Protein is not directly ergogenic, but it's an opportunity to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and inhibit muscle protein breakdown. And all of these things are positive contributors, at least indirectly, to athletic performance and the health and the staying power of the athlete. And so optimal per meal protein dosing targets, once again, it's that 0.4 to 0.55 grams per kilogram of body weight that would maximize muscle protein synthesis. And this makes it an ideal target for each protein dose. So that takes care of acute / time sensitive fueling requirements in the pre-exercise period. And acute time sensitive requirements for endurance competition during exercise are as follows. So recommended rates of fluid intake are about 0.4 to 0.8 liters per hour, and high sweat rates can require a whole lot more than that, up to 2 liters an hour. Now, the pacing of fluid intake is about 6 to 12 ounces every 10 to 15 minutes throughout the training or competition. All right, so now for the carbohydrate dosing for endurance events that last 1 to 2 hours, we're looking at a rate of carbohydrate intake at 30 to 60 grams per hour. And as always, a 6 to 8% solution of carbohydrate has been shown to have the fastest gastric emptying rate and the best results as far as providing glucose to working muscles at a maximal rate per unit of time. And so 30 to 60 grams per hour within a 6 to 8% solution, and that translates roughly to 60 to 80 grams per liter. So 60 to 80 grams of carbohydrate per liter of fluid ingested. And sodium would be dosed at 300 to 600 milligrams per liter of fluid. And carbohydrate for endurance events lasting 2 hours or longer just have some larger dosing. So we're looking at 60 to 90 grams per hour within that same 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution, which is typical with your commercial beverages like Gatorade. And this would be about 60 to 80 grams of carbohydrate per liter. Sodium dosing for endurance events lasting 2 hours or longer are higher, so about double of what you would consume for shorter endurance events. And for These longer endurance events, you'd be looking at 600 to 1200 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid ingested. And then once again, multiple transportable carbohydrates with a glucose to fructose ratio ranging 1:1 to 2:1. So that would be obtainable from your kind of standard sports beverages like Gatorade. And finally, we're at protein. So protein dosed at 0.15 grams per kilogram per hour. In other words, roughly 8 to 15 grams of protein or 5 to 10 grams of essential amino acids per hour. Now, this has been shown to suppress exercise-induced muscle damage specifically by Saunders and colleagues. He did some classic work, or they did some classic work on that and found that dosing to be effective. And it should be noted that their research didn't involve pre-exercise protein bolus, but it is more of a hedge your bets in the right direction type of maneuver. And so if you were to pull out all the stops for preventing muscle protein breakdown during endurance events, then you could potentially do that by employing either that small dose of protein, 8 to 15 grams per hour, or 5 to 10 grams of EAA per hour. All right, so post-exercise requirements for endurance competition. Carbohydrate dosing for maximizing the rate of post-exercise glycogen resynthesis is 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour for 4 to 6 hours post-exercise, like on the hour. And this is particularly necessary when you have two glycogen depleting events within a single day, and especially if your time frame to recover and maximally resynthesize glycogen is limited to 8 hours or less, you're definitely going to want to use this strategy of consuming 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour for 4 to 6 hours post-exercise. Okay, fluid consumption post-exercise. For every kilogram of body weight you lose, you should consume a little bit more in terms of fluid. So 1.25 to 1.5 liters of fluid for every kilogram of body weight lost. Sodium should not be restricted in the post-exercise period, especially after prolonged endurance events. Post-exercise protein feeding is not directly ergogenic, but once again, it's an opportunity to feed. It's an opportunity to push protein turnover towards the positive, so stimulating muscle protein synthesis and inhibiting muscle protein breakdown. And of course, it's an opportunity to fulfill total daily protein requirements anyway. You're going to be set up and, it's going to be time to eat anyway after an endurance event. So definitely there's going to be protein involved. And once again, the optimal protein dose for stimulating muscle protein synthesis is around 0.4 to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, which in imperial terms is about 0.2 to 0.25 grams per pound, which in absolute terms comes out to about 30 to 50 grams of protein. All right, so this is some very recent research that kind of makes us think twice about the idea that post-exercise carbs are not necessary as long as you hit the total and as long as you're not competing on the same day with the same glycogen depleted muscles. And I will explain what I mean. So this new study by Diaz Lara and colleagues, it found that it was actually detrimental to delay post-exercise carbs. It was detrimental to next day performance. And this is despite equivalent glycogen levels reached on the day of testing, the following day. Okay, so in a double-blind crossover design, 9 recreationally active, so not like elite or highly trained, recreationally active men performed high-intensity interval exercise. in the fed state. So this was a diligent design because they're looking at what happens in the real world. Subjects repeated as many high intensity intervals as possible to task failure in order to assess endurance performance. Okay, so during the 3 hours post exercise, the subjects drank either carbohydrate at a very high dose, 2.4 grams per kilogram, so a little bit over a gram per pound of a carbohydrate dose, or the control condition, which was water. This was during the 3 hours post exercise. So carbohydrate intake over 24 hours post exercise was matched between the conditions at a nice healthy 7 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And now the kicker, or not quite the kicker, almost the kicker. Delaying post exercise carbohydrate intake by 3 hours did not alter muscle glycogen resynthesis compared to immediate refueling. So they both arrived at the same glycogen levels the next day. All right, so here is the kicker. Delaying carbohydrate intake by 3 hours in this case reduced the next day high intensity interval exercise capacity and increased rate of perceived exertion despite similar glycogen levels between conditions. So something happened there that goes beyond mere total glycogen levels at the time of testing. So apparently there is something going on with the delay of carbohydrate intake after endurance exercise that can impair next day endurance exercise if the delay is significant, in this case 3 hours. So this is a new avenue of research. What I'll probably do is email the lead author, or just email Louise Burke, who might have the choice speculations on how on what mechanistically might have underpinned these results. But interesting stuff, food for thought. Okay, getting fancy. It's periodizing carbohydrate intake, and this is the fuel for the work required model by Impey and colleagues. Impey or Impey, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. And what this shows over here, this table, so this is presented for elite endurance athletes. So like, for example, road cyclists in this particular example who train once a day on a 4 consecutive day model. And in this example, the athlete has 4 main feeding points, and specific carbohydrate amounts should be tailored to individual energy demands. And that's kind of the whole point, is that you're not eating the same amount of carbohydrates each day, because the different workouts are going to be different intensities and duration. And some of them are going to be significantly more demanding than others. And then the carbohydrate intake reflects that. So this model illustrates how the train low paradigms can be combined to adjust carbohydrate availability day by day and meal by meal according to the demands of the specific training session. And so you can just take some time to examine this table and see how carbohydrate intake is positioned at the pre-training meal and during training and post-training and the evening meal. And you kind of can get this, at least conceptually, get an idea of how carbohydrate can be manipulated to reflect the training demands. And so I highlighted the final bullet point here because it's easy to get lost in the fine details when really, with something like carbohydrate periodization or fuel tailoring, the simple approaches work just as good as the complex approaches. So put simply, carb intake and timing for the day is tailored to the intensity and duration of the training demand. So in this particular model, you have high carb intakes low carb intakes, and moderate carb intakes or medium carb intakes. And you just basically match that with the type of day you're facing in terms of what type of training you're going to engage in. So, systematizing this carb tailoring or carb periodizing process, the steps would go like this: establish an average daily carb target, and then identify the days that will require time sensitive carb fueling. And this is dictated by performance demands, especially for intensive, exhaustive type of training bouts that exceed 70 minutes. And we're going by Colombani and Pochmuller's findings with their systematic reviews and with Pochmuller's meta-analysis that found that whenever you're facing an exercise bout that is an exhaustive 70 to 90 minutes or more, then you can benefit from extra carb fueling. So the third step is to determine the relative need to non-linearize your daily carbohydrate intake. And this is going to be dependent on how time-sensitive carb fueling might impact the carb total for the day. In other words, does the extra carbohydrate that you're adding to fuel these training bouts, so in other words, the 30 to 60 grams per hour during training, combined with the 1 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight as a carb dose that you would consume in the 4 hours leading to the event, does that amount? And of course, there's also the possibility of having to slam massive amounts of carbs after the fact if you're looking at replenishing carbohydrates or replenishing glycogen as quickly as possible in order to perform competitively either on that same day or on the next day. And so, okay, back to point number 3. I'll read it over again. Determine the relative need to non-linearized daily carbohydrate intake, and this would depend on how time-sensitive carb fueling might impact the carb total for the day. Does this extra carb intake make you exceed the average daily carb target? If it does, then subtract an equivalent amount of carbs from other days where it happens to be feasible to do so. And this would be done in order to even out the extra carbs added to those extra fueling days. Because you still want to maintain by the end of the week your average, your assigned carb target. That would be appropriate that for your total daily intake that you determined at the very beginning when you worked out total calories and then macronutrient targets. So, for example, if a particular day that has a particularly voluminous load of endurance training to complete, if that particular day happens to have an extra 50 grams of carbs or 50 to 100 grams of carbs on that day, then you would have to find another day to reduce that day by 50 to 100 carbs in order to even out and arrive at the same average daily carb target by the end of the week. So it's just a kind of a game of addition and subtraction here. If the time-sensitive carb fueling does not impact the carb total for the day, then you really don't have to worry about anything. You don't have to, specifically try to non-linearize your carb intake through the week. Unless you really want an exceptionally high amount of carbs on some days and very low amounts of carbs on the other days. That can be a personal preference thing. So carb tailoring is useful mainly for individuals seeking to economize carb intake overall, but also happen to have significant endurance fueling demands on certain days. So those are the conditions where you would carb tailor or periodize your carb intake, is if you don't have a huge amount of carbs to work with in the first place. Okay, Let's tie this all together with summary points. And this is the summary points of the entire module. And like I said at the beginning, these summary points are going to be a summary of the summary. There's no way I can possibly summarize all the details I covered, but here we go. So the first point is that energy production for athletic performance involves a symphony of bioenergetic pathways. And this is dependent on both intensity and fuel availability. All right, determining total daily energy needs for athletic performance is important, and it's a matter of putting educated guesses to trial. And once again, you can use the alanaragon.com/diet calculator to help you make these educated guesses about total daily energy needs. Fueling for strength performance is similar in principle to fueling for endurance performance, with comparatively less dependence on dietary carbohydrate. As much as some would like to think otherwise, carbs are the most important fuel in terms of physiological availability when it comes to maximizing athletic performance. That's just the breaks. Well, I'm sorry to break this to anybody who's really emotionally invested in the idea of carb restriction being something special. But like we reviewed over a battery of studies, it is a bet that you would not want to take. So carb restriction is a bet that you probably would not want to take if the competitive stakes are very high. A nuanced look at the research on ketogenic diets and athletic performance underscores the relationship between competition levels and the stakes and the diet composition that you would prescribe or that you would program. And I'm specifically talking about Burke et al.'s dashboard of studies showing that 9 studies showed a decrement in performance with the ketogenic diet, and 1 study showed improvement in performance with a ketogenic diet, and 9 studies showed no significant difference between the ketogenic group and the control group. So we're seeing a clear leaning towards benefit with the higher carb intake compared to the ketogenic diet intake, which has a much higher risk for performance decrements, especially with endurance performance. And finally, the practical applications in this area are a complex set of maneuvers. So make sure you save this information for reference purposes. Make sure you secure this information. We don't expect you to memorize all of the fine little details and the numbers and all of that. So definitely use this module as a reference module, unless all you're going to be doing is working with competitive athletes and then you do it for enough times to get these values and these targets memorized. And that's fine too. But I realize that as nutritional coaches, the majority of our clients are going to want body composition improvement. And the majority of those people are going to want reduction in fat mass. So out of all the full range of our clients, only a minority are going to be seeking improvements in athletic performance. So the chances that you're going to be constantly using the information in this module are a lot lower than the information that you might use in the fat loss modules, or including the plateau module as well, and the muscle gain module. So this information is a little bit more on the fringe, but it is a lot of small details. And with that, now go forth and create some super athletes.